Welcome, everybody. This is Now That's Debatable. I'm your host, Fantastic Facade. I am joined with my co host, as usual, Geocentric Skeptic. And today we have a very special guest speaker, Sean Maguire, who is a professor. I will let him do a little more of introduction for himself in just a moment. But wanted to address a few things on our end really quickly. Today we're going to be discussing abortion, although we have taken on the topic before. We are going to be doing it with some different positions in mind. We have some positions that are counter to our own and a very intelligent interlocutor to have debate with us. So we're very appreciative of that. We're almost at 400 likes on our page, and I think we have a little over 400 people in our Facebook group. So thank you guys for that. And if you don't mind, give us a like, a follow, a share, etc. And we'd like to see you there. But without taking up any more of our time, let's go ahead and get Sean to introduce himself, and then we'll take off with our debate. Sean, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you
Perfect.
for having me, Facade and Geo. As you said, I am Sean Maguire. I am a pro-life advocate. I have been
Hey,
working.
hey,
Yeah,
Sean, 1 second. Beside, where are you streaming to?
It should be streaming to Facebook, to YouTube, and to Twitch all simultaneously.
I don't see it on Facebook.
Let's pull it real quick just to make sure.
You're streaming to your personal page. That's what's going on.
Oh, am I? Let's
Yep,
change
and I
this.
just found it. But I can no, just to keep the same stream that we can keep it on one link.
Okay.
I'm just gonna share it to the page and everywhere else. Those all good.
Got it. Usually doesn't.
well,
do that
nice.
here.
Now that I'm being shared to the page. um, One aspect that is going to be unique for this discussion, perhaps, is the legal aspect. I've been licensed as an attorney since 2016. So the Supreme Court decision recently is a big part of the pro-life discussion that we might have tonight. I currently work as an educator at a high school, private high school in central Pennsylvania, and as an adjunct professor of government at Cairn University. I appreciate you guys having me on, and I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Yeah, man. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. We are very appreciative. Know you're an intelligent guy. I've known you quite a while, so we're excited to get it going and kind of interested to hear what you have to say and your stance and see if we can either find some middle ground or find where we disagree or maybe just find some discord altogether.
Yeah, well, I'd like to start with just laying out my pro-life position. There's a speaker named Scott Klusendorf, and he does the 5-minute pro-lifer. So don't hold me to it strictly, but I'm going to try to make my pro-life argument in 5 minutes. Is it all right with you guys? I go ahead right into that.
Yeah, no
Absolutely.
problem.
Take off.
Perfect. So the pro-life position that I hold is one that says abortion is always morally wrong. Now, to do this properly, I must start by defining my terms. I have to define abortion. Abortion, when I discuss it, is referring only to the intentional taking of an unborn human life in the womb. I'm not talking about the medical definition of abortion. I'm not being super precise in this term. I'm using it colloquially. So abortion means the intentional taking of the human life in the womb. My argument relies on a logical syllogism. It is wrong to take an innocent human life. Abortion takes an innocent human life. Therefore, abortion is always wrong. That's all there is to it. It is morally wrong, and I keep on inserting that because we're going to talk about the civil law later, but it is morally wrong to take an innocent human life. Abortion takes an innocent human life, therefore abortion is always morally wrong. The premise that I have there is that the unborn are human beings, that they're morally equivalent to all other human beings. So to talk about that, I'm going to have to describe the scientific evidence for the unborn life being human. From the moment of sperm-egg fusion, a new, unique, whole, living organism comes into being and begins its life. What that being is depends on the parentage. So in terms of human reproduction, the moment a sperm and an egg fuse together, there is a new, whole, unique, living human being. This is a point that's made very clear when you consult any embryology textbook. The moment life begins is when a single cell organism called a zygote begins to grow and self-direct its own development. Given enough time, nurture, energy, it will grow into a full adult of the species, in this case, human. Now, that's scientifically, they are human beings. And then the argument is, are they morally equivalent to adult human beings? And my position is that there are no distinctions between the unborn human being you once were, the zygote you once were, and the adult you are today that is morally significant such that it's okay to kill you then, but not now. The only differences between the zygote you were and the human adult you are developmental differences that are based in age. There are 4 categories of these differences. You're different in your size. You're no longer one cell. You're different in your level of development. You have developed a lot of different abilities over time. You're different in your environment. You're no longer in your mother's womb. You're now mobile, able to adapt to new environments. And you have changed in your degree of dependency. You're not completely dependent upon your mother for life and existence anymore. All of these traits, size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency, are attributes of our age in our human development. We change as we get older. We increase in size and level of development. Our environment changes and our degree of dependency changes. Sometimes those elements go up and down, but our value does not change based on any of those differences. And those are all of the differences between an unborn human being and a born human being. What changes is our capacity. It does not change. Our value remains the same. So I have a presupposition that all human beings are equally valuable, and my presupposition is that they are equally highly valuable, and they should be equally protected by the law. So even if we grow bigger, even if we get more developed, even if we change our environment, even if we are less dependent on our mothers, we're not more valuable because of any of those things. So the pro-life position is quite simple, the one that I hold. Abortion is always wrong because it takes an innocent human life. The unborn are human life. They are human beings scientifically, and philosophically, ethically, and morally, there's no distinction between an unborn human being and a born human being, such that taking a life at one stage is acceptable and taking a life at another stage is not. That's the entirety of my position. I believe every human being is equal and should be protected with an equal, with the equality of the law.
Gotcha.
So, I think that I did that in 5 minutes.
I think you were so close that I should have broken out a timer. That was very well done. Thank you.
It was. I got a question. So now you said the zygote is a separate, unique human, right? Because it has. And what was the criteria establishing that? Because it has separate DNA.
I didn't go into the criteria, but yes, okay. There is a unique species at the level of zygote. Not a unique species, a unique member of the species.
Gotcha. And why do you say it's unique?
Well, the genetic information is
because of the DNA, right? Because the DNA is different from the mother.
That's
and the father.
That's definitely part of it. But even in the case of twins that share genetic information, the DNA is identical. They are able to respond to the environment independently of any other member of the species. They are an individual member of it.
Is there any more criteria so that they can respond to the environment and there's a separate DNA? What else?
In general terms, I mean, those are the distinctions.
Okay.
What the reality is, they're living. That's when you're talking about the responding to the environment. That's part of the definition of life that usually is talked about. Responding to stimuli as part of that.
Okay.
But I'm not a geneticist. I'm not able to go into great detail, but just from a general knowledge base, which all of my argument depends upon general knowledge. The members of the species are independently identifiable and distinct from every other member of the species.
Perfect. Okay, so because when I was listening to the criteria for what makes it like a separate, distinct organism apart from the mother from the father, so we established was DNA. We talked about responding to outside environments, etc. So, what problem I have a sperm seems to fit all of those criteria as well.
The one thing is that the sperm is not self-directing. The zygote is the beginning of an organism that is self-directing. It actually is accomplishing its own motive, its own goal. Sperm is actually part of another organism that is released. So every part of our body is, and that's the distinct, whole, unique, living individual. That's what the distinct and whole is a very important
So
part
what
of
you
that
mean
criteria.
it is part of like a larger body? Like I mean like if I eject it from my body, it's like it's no longer part of me. It is totally separate.
Well, it's
Right?
not physically connected anymore, but it originates from you and only exists as a part of you. Leave it to its own device. It will die and decay. Like
But
our skin
if you
cells
leave,
are constantly sloughing off in huge numbers.
sure,
Each skin cell is a part of us. Each sperm cell is a part of the man who's released it, but it is not a whole human being. It is a part of
but I
one
was gonna
human
say,
being.
so you said like if you leave a sperm to its own devices, it'll die. Like
Yes.
a zygote would too. Matter of fact, so would a 2-year-old.
Right,
If you leave it to its own devices, so that can't be part of the criteria. Right?
But given even as much nutrient as you can possibly provide it, the sperm still dies. But if you neglect a human being, the only reason the human being dies is not because of its nature, but because it lacks the resources needed to continue life. The zygote would continue life as long as it has the shelter and the nutrients available to it to do so. If the sperm's in the perfect environment to continue life, it will die because its nature is to die. It's temporary. It is only part of a human being.
So
I mean, a 2-year-old would eventually die as well.
Without the nutrients and care required to keep a 2-year-old alive.
Even with the nutrients, I mean, that would apply to every single biological organism ever. Like it's
right, correct. We are all finite in the end.
Yeah. So, what I'm saying is that can't be part of the criteria as well, because that would what you said that applies to the sperm applies to zygote and 2-year-olds and everything else as well. The fact that if it doesn't have the nutrients it needs, then it's going to die. And
right,
just
the
like
nature of the sperm is to act as part of a human being, whereas the nature of a zygote is a whole individual human being. It's not part of another human being. It is a whole human being that will self-direct its own growth and full maturity. The sperm doesn't self-direct its own growth and full maturity. It ceases to exist when it accomplishes its goal.
I mean, so that's a teleological argument. So the problem is because you're saying that the sperm's goal is to reach an egg or die. Right now, that's what it does. But that doesn't mean that's what it's.
What it does is die, whether purposes
along
or not.
with everything else.
I believe that it is purposed because it's designed with a purpose, but we can leave the teleological argument aside. The nature of a sperm is not to continue into a whole to a full-grown adult human being. The nature of a zygote is to develop into a full, whole human being, an adult human being. That's the distinction. One is whole, one is part.
Oh, I mean, the sperm is a whole sperm.
Yes, not a whole human being. A zygote is a
But it's not
whole.
okay. But so like, do you understand like how like phylogeny works, like cladistics, when we're talking about what a species is, right? We don't define what a species is by the way it looks or its DNA. We define it by its heritage. So like, you're a human because you came from humans, right? It doesn't matter if you had like 8 arms and a beak
Right.
and feathers and look like some monster. Because of your heritage, you are classified as
Absolutely
human.
right.
So, right, and so now sperm, sperm, because they came from a human, would be human.
Yes, it's a
They
human
would fit
sperm.
under. Oh, I mean, sure. And we could say it's a human zygote, but it doesn't make it any less human. It is still 100% human.
Absolutely agree. I hope I'm not communicating that the zygote is not human, because that's
No,
not
no,
at
no,
all
no,
what
no,
I'm
no,
trying to communicate.
no. Well, but it sounds like
Oh
you're
no, it
suggesting
is
that the
human. It
sperm
is not a
isn't human.
whole human being. It's part of a human. Just like
So,
my arm is part of a human and my leg is part of a human, my sperm is part of a human. It is not a whole human being. But a zygote is a whole human being.
so when you say a whole human being, like uh, what does the sperm lack that the zygote has that makes it a whole human being?
The entire genetic structure and
Okay, so you said
capacity
the
to develop into an
capacity,
adult
right?
human
Because
being.
it obviously doesn't have like the genetic structure, right? Because
Correct.
I mean, it's just some cells right now.
Well,
So,
a sperm is lacking even more than my arm because it only has half of the genetic information of me.
well,
So,
sure. And so as the zygote grows, into a fetus and more, and grows arms and legs and a heart and all that kind of stuff, right? So it gets closer to what we would identify as, like, fully developed humans like you and
right.
I, right? The zygote see just at the point at conception, that seems to be just an arbitrary um barrier that you're putting in from my point of view. I mean, the way I see it, it's just the whole process, like the sperm, and then it meets the egg and turn into a zygote. But you're cutting the line right at when at conception, right?
Absolutely. I am cutting the line at conception. And
And,
if you look to embryology textbooks, that's when unique individual members of species
but
begin
when we
their
talk about
life and
unique,
development.
right? Because we
Looking,
talk about how
it is unique.
so because like we're talking about the genetic makeup. The genetic makeup of a sperm is not identical from to its donor.
Correct.
So in
It's
that
actually
sense,
less than the donor.
yes, it's exactly half.
Right.
And so you can make an argument that it is a distinct human
Yes,
creature.
but not whole. You could argue that it's a distinct human. It's a distinct human cell.
You, you're,
Each sperm is a distinct human cell, but a distinct whole
But is it? But your
human cell.
definition of whole seems to be arbitrary because you're saying a
Mhm.
zygote is whole, but a
Yes.
sperm isn't. And you're saying
Yes.
the
And
reason
let
the
me tell you
zygote is
why.
whole because it has more potential than the sperm
No, no,
because
no,
it's
no, no.
earlier. Okay.
No, it by its nature, it's capable of growing into an adult. But its nature is already there at one cell. No matter how far it develops in adulthood, whether it dies as a zygote or continues through adulthood, he or she, and I should use he or she because gender is determined at zygotic stage, he or she is already filled with all the information necessary to fully live a human
Okay. So
life. That's the distinction.
what if the zygote had some sort of mutation
Yes,
right there, whereas it was not going to fully develop? Like it
right.
wouldn't. So is that not human?
No, it's still human, but it's a human with a disease or a human with a disability or a human with a deformity. A human
But
with a mutation that can be fatal. Still human.
well,
but
sperm is
flawed.
human as well. But
Right.
but you're saying, but your difference between the zygote and the sperm is that the zygote has, you're saying it has all the potential. When I'm talking about a zygote with a mutation where now it lacks that potential to
Yeah.
grow
So
into a full baby. Now,
no. Again, I'm not saying that it is human because it has the potential to grow into a whole human. I'm saying that it is human and it has the potential to grow into a whole human, a full adult human.
I mean,
It
it may or
already
may.
is human. A zygote is a full individual zygote. We go from zygote to blastocyst to embryo to fetus to baby to toddler. All of those are different stages of our development. It's not an arbitrary line to say that zygote is when life begins, because that's when all of the information has been inserted. There's no new introduction of information from beyond the point of zygote. Once you are a zygote, you don't get any new information ever. The
Sure,
genetic code is set.
that life begins. You said that life begins at the zygote stage.
Yes.
Now, the egg and the sperm are already alive.
Yes, but they are not a life. That's the
Sure
thing.
they are.
It's a. No. They
You could
are.
take my sperm and you could kill me. My sperm would still exist and still be able to
For a
live.
very,
live.
very short duration.
But if you could, you can
in
freeze
proper
it. But
yeah.
regardless of the duration, it's not dependent on me for its survival. It could
Yes,
survive in the body of a
sperm
woman
could
for
survive.
for
I would
days.
never.
So let's say like let's say I have sex with my wife and the sperm is in her for a few days and then
Yeah.
I die. My sperm is going to continue living.
Yes.
So this is a separate life. You couldn't even say that it's me because you would have to say that I'm still alive even though I'm dead because there's a sperm flying
No.
around in my wife.
No, I don't accept that argument. Part of you is not you. Part of you is not an individual. Part
Well,
of an individual
I would
is
say
not
it's not me at all.
Individual.
I would say that it's not me at all because it doesn't even have the same genetic makeup. Like as we established, it only has half. And so, and if you're gonna say so, here's the main thing I'm getting to. If how could life start at conception if you have life prior to conception?
Because of the law that you can't have life from non-life. Living things produce living things. Yes, you have two adult human parents that are both alive. They bring forth a human
I'm not even.
that is also alive. It requires life to create life, generate life. But it's a unique new life that comes into being at the zygote stage. It's not a continuation of the mother. It's not a continuation of the father individually. It's a unique new human life that begins at zygote. That's what I'm saying. It's not that life as a concept begins at zygote.
No, that's not what I'm
Individual
saying.
life begins at zygote. Whether it's human or cat or dog, whatever mammal you're talking about, every mammal begins a new life at a zygote stage.
Sure.
That's what I'm arguing. It's that everything before that was dead. No, that's not true. It's that the sperm and the egg fulfill their design. They join together. Both of them cease to exist. And a new, unique, whole, living human being begins their development. That's what happens at sperm-egg fusion.
Okay, but what I'm saying is you have life prior to conception, right? In the sperm. I'm not even talking about me, right? Sperm is alive. It has separate DNA. The sperm even has a separate will, right? Because oops, baby, right? When you don't want her to get pregnant, but that sperm wants to get her pregnant. So even has a different will. Is it a separate? It is separate, distinct from me, not contingent on my life in perpetuity for its existence. So I don't see how you could say that the life starts at conception when you have life prior. If you're saying it's a new life, sure. But the point is the sperm is also a new life. just as separate from me as the zygote.
The moral value that I'm arguing here is that your life began when you were a zygote. My life began when I was a zygote, and every adult you've ever met began their life as a zygote. I'm arguing that abortion is wrong, but I'm not going to make any arguments about the disbursement of sperm cells. I don't care about parts of human life nearly as much as I care about human lives, plural, as whole unique individuals.
I don't
of the
see how a
species.
sperm.
Facade,
Oh
you
yeah,
haven't
we
said
are.
anything
We're
in a
going
long
at it.
time. We
Facade.
keep on beating this horse when it's well dead.
I would agree. I think we're past the point of beating that dead horse. I just wanted to kind of see if I can come to some agreement / conclusion on this before we move on to something else, because if I can't, I think we should move on either way. My question is just going to be a clarifying one, and it's addressed to Sean because I think I see the argument that Gio's trying to make, because we've had the argument privately. My question is, given that sperm can exist in the male for upwards of 80 days before ejaculation and live on a few days within the life of in the body of a potential mother donor of an egg, essentially you have the half of the DNA of a mother, half of the DNA of a father. You're saying the fusion is what makes a new whole human life. I think the argument being made is that it is the individual structure of each sperm cell, each sperm, not the necessarily the seminal fluid, but the sperm itself and each individual egg that already has the encoding of DNA that will determine the value of a human, assuming that they are bonded together. So in any case of you could say an individual had essentially been alive upwards of 80 days on a father's side and around 30 days on a mother's side, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, depending on their cycle of menstruation. That genetic code exists the entire time during that time frame. I think Gio's getting hung up on how you're making it, or how you're saying it's an individual only at the point these two come together, because they exist at least upwards of they can exist upwards of 80 days in the male and upwards of 30 days in a female, long before they ever come together. And that genetic structure is going to be unique and specific to those if and when they do join.
I appreciate the clarification because I wasn't following that. That's an interesting take that Gio's making here, that because the sperm is alive prior to fusion and the egg is alive prior to fusion, the individual life must be beginning when they are alive. I don't know how to answer that philosophically. I've never run into that question before. It's an interesting thought experiment, but what I can point to is the fact that because those outcomes are not necessary, I would be really hesitant to say that sperm and egg are individual human beings prior to fusion, just because the outcome is so unlikely for the vast majority of both cases. The haploid cells that are involved in reproduction rarely, in broad terms, compared to their magnitude of number, rarely actually fuse. So I would never classify human life as beginning based on the haploid cell that originates them. I would say that the bright line rule that embryology textbooks point to is when that fusion does actually occur.
I think the problem
that's when the new life begins.
Yeah,
It's not dependent upon the information available before that actual occurrence of the fusion.
I appreciate the clarification, and I think the whole argument, at least on the other side, was that it seems that it's almost arbitrary because the information exists prior to their fusion. I think that was kind of the whole crux of the argument. I think we kind of got bogged down there. I do want to thank you for your clarification. Unless you wanted to expand on it anymore, I think we can just move on and go from there.
It is interesting because I have never heard that before, but my initial response is the information is available, but the information has not actually come together So that's why I would hesitate to say life begins anytime before the information actually comes together.
And I just for my sake, for my own clarity, do you think that the zygote has to be implanted in the uterine wall before it's an individual new life, or do you think it's at the moment the sperm penetrates the shell of the egg?
Yeah, when sperm-egg fusion is accomplished, there is a new, unique, whole living individual of the species. So that's when new life begins. That's when an individual life begins. It doesn't require anything else. If it fails to fuse, if it fails to implant, it dies. But what dies is a whole, unique, living individual of the species, nothing less and nothing more.
Fair enough. Gio, did you have anything you wanted to comment?
I think my comment would just continue with the conversation. I mean, with the honestly beating a dead horse, because I was going to say that the criteria that you gave for what makes it unique, and that's why I spent so much time establishing that criteria. Sperm meets all of those. It interacts with the environment on its own. It even has a separate will. It has its own unique DNA, and but I think this is probably not something we're not going to agree on not on this podcast.
Fair enough. I say we move on to another topic. We can continue in the order. The order is presented by Sean. Of course, if you'd like to alter the
Sean,
order,
anywhere you wanted to
go. It
anywhere
doesn't matter. We're okay with it. Or if you'd
Well,
like to stick
I think
to the
we should
structure,
move away from the initial argument that we just had that was very interesting and worth considering further. But we should go to something much calmer and talk about the Supreme Court case that just came out.
Okay.
Sure.
That was a joke. You guys are supposed to laugh.
I mean, it's
anything
definitely
but
calmer
calm.
because I mean, I think the Supreme Court case is undoubtedly
been
calmer than
insane.
life itself.
So-
but
Fasad, you're cutting out. I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
no worries. I said I think the Supreme Court case might be a little less significant than life itself, but so we can talk about it. Let's do it.
Sure. So a lot of people look at the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade on June 24th, as like undoing law. And I think it's important to understand what the Supreme Court does and what the Supreme Court does not do. So back in 1973, the Supreme Court passed Roe versus Wade, and it did not say abortion must be legal in every state. What they said was it's unconstitutional for states to restrict access to abortion. So the legislatures of the individual states and then the federal legislature and Congress, they're the ones that have what's called police powers to actually protect the health, welfare, and livelihoods of their people and the citizens in the states. The Supreme Court doesn't have that power. So the Supreme Court doesn't make laws, but it does decide if laws are violating the U.S. Constitution, which supersedes all the laws. So when the Supreme Court said in 1973, states cannot restrict access to abortion, that undid state laws against abortion in all 50 states. Some states had liberalized their laws and allowed abortions in late cases, but not in all cases. Other states had complete bans. The majority of states had complete bans on abortion. And that just upturned everything, and the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional to restrict access to abortion. But they didn't really say why. They struggled with their reason. They said it's something to do with privacy, but we don't know if that's the Fifth Amendment or the Sixth Amendment or the 13th Amendment. We don't really know, and we don't really care. It's definitely in there. And I'm being a little bit harsh with the court, but they deserve a little bit of harshness. Because they didn't reason very well. In 1996, they had the opportunity to overturn Roe. They were presented with the case in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, coming out of Pennsylvania. And they decided in a very, very, very narrow decision that they were going to keep the core holding of Roe, but they're going to get rid of most of its rationale and its structure. And so then the court said, states can restrict abortion, but they can only do it insofar as it doesn't cause an undue burden to a woman. And so from 1996 until now, we've seen how that's played out. state law is all over the place. The Supreme Court is always asked, hey, is this an undue burden? The court's like, we don't know. And they go back and forth in all the cases, and it's a mess. So what happened on June 24th is the court finally came down and said, Roe, Casey, they're overturned. Those were wrong decisions. The Supreme Court was wrong. The Constitution does not restrict the ability of states to regulate abortion. So now, all that did was put it back on the states. So now states have to make these decisions through their legislative bodies, whether they allow abortion, whether they don't allow abortion, etc. So we're looking at what's happened is a number of states, I think it's 15 states, had immediate bans of abortion go into effect. Majority of states, nothing changed. They still allow abortion up until as late as they did before Dobbs v. Jackson was decided, and they will until the legislature changes it. So that's my really quick rundown of the legal history of Roe and its demise.
So I just wanted to, I appreciate the candor. I think you have probably a better history and knowledge of the history on the topic than I do, at least personally. And I'm not sure about Gio. I won't speak for him. But I did want to bring up, because in your initial definition of abortion, you said you found it always immoral to take an innocent human, unborn human life in the uterus. And I used, to me, when using such a term as always or never, that means no exceptions for any reason at all. Mm-hmm. I just asked for, is there genuinely no exception, and that meaning in cases of obvious jeopardy to the mother's life?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, Fasad. You asked this question right after talking about the Supreme Court. I talked about the Supreme Court and its history. I want to make a clear distinction. When I say that it's always immoral, I'm not necessarily saying it should always be illegal.
I agree, but that's kind of the reason I brought it up.
And what is legal.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's kind of why I brought it up, because I think as far as the legality concerns, this is obviously where we're going to go here. Essentially, yes. What's your stance? Where do you think on the legality issue of abortion? Do you think that should be essentially a national right versus a states' right issue, or what's your stance there?
I'm kind of conflicted, to be honest. I tend to think of the states as sovereigns, and I tend to think that states should have more police power and the federal government should have less. But there are certain issues where the integrity of the nation as a whole is at issue, and I think issues like the treatment of individuals and discrimination against individuals based on their distinctions, whether it's race or sex or age, are matters of federal importance that should be responded to federally. So in my ideal solution would be a federal constitutional amendment to ensure that the 13th Amendment applies to all individual human beings, no matter what age they are. But how that plays out, there's room for different opinions on what the law should do. But I don't think there's any room for a difference of opinion on what is morally right. What is morally right is that we do not kill innocent human beings, no matter what age they are. You did ask about the medical risk to the mother, and I'll address that if you want me to right now.
If you don't mind, because it seems that if we essentially, I don't think there's the question isn't necessarily a moral one here. It's a legal one. If we make a legality stating that it's always illegal, because if you make your legal, if you make your laws based around your morals, which oftentimes happens, not always, but it often does happen, and you often see that kind of aligning. But if you make laws regarding your morals, in all cases, abortion would be illegal as well. Not saying you necessarily promote that. I'm just curious where you stand on the issue.
I personally do promote that, to be clear. I do want all abortions to be illegal, all human abortions. I'm not talking about animal abortions, but all human abortions should be illegal. I think the law should equally protect every human being, no matter what age they are. Now, when that, presuming that ever happens, that a state or a country does make it illegal to have an abortion, there's support for the argument that I'm about to state. There is no reason, there's no situation known to man where an abortion is medically necessary. Remember, my definition of abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn human being. Now, there are times when the unborn human being and the mother cannot both survive. But the solution to that is not to intentionally kill one of them. It is to take every step necessary to save one, or both if possible. And sometimes those steps necessarily result in the death of the other, especially in situations such as the classic example is ectopic pregnancy. And it's a good example because this is a situation where a woman has an unborn human child growing in her, but not in the womb. That's ectopic. It means it's implanted, he or she is implanted somewhere else. Usually ectopic pregnancies are not capable of coming to full term. Although I heard of one that he was implanted in her abdomen, and I have no idea how that happens. And she didn't know, which I have no idea how that happens. And she delivered a healthy child through cesarean. And that's bizarre. But typically, ectopic pregnancies implant in the fallopian tube, which is incompatible. The child will die. The fallopian tube would rupture. The child would die. The woman would face serious health effects and possible death based on all of the internal injury. So in that case, the solution is not abortion. It's not the intentional killing of the unborn child. It's a salpingectomy or another medical intervention that removes the unborn child from the fallopian tube, protecting the woman from immediate harm. And if we had the capacity to keep the child alive, we would. Currently, we don't have that capacity. So necessarily the child will die, but our intention was to save the life that we could save when both would otherwise die. So my moral reasoning there is that when we have the capacity to save a life, knowing that another life would be lost, as long as we know that with reasonable certainty that both would die without intervention, it's morally right to intervene to save the life we can.
Okay, so I think that's going to kind of play, and we don't have to jump into it directly. I think we can continue the conversation of legality if you'd like. The same with Geo, if you're still there. I hadn't heard you talk in a while, but
Yeah. Oh yeah, but it's gonna play right into bodily autonomy. Is that what you're gonna say, Fasad?
That's exactly what I wanted to say. Before I do that, we had a comment that says, "What do you think about abortion?" The whole discussion here, we have a professor that is pro-life, and that's the whole conversation. So if you just keep listening, and you have specific questions, Mr. Jim, please feel free to ask them. We have a very educated and intelligent professor guest starring on the show today that was very gracious to come along, and we have two people that just like to have a good discussion as the co-host. So we like to argue. So keep listening, and I think you'll kind of get both of our stances and both of our arguments on both sides. And if you have specific questions, please address them to either Sean or the host, and we will answer them accordingly.
So I like to jump into this bodily autonomy thing. If you don't mind, Fasad.
I'm good with it. I think it would be up to Sean here.
Go right ahead. I mean, I'm on the show to answer questions.
Okay, awesome. So my view, bodily autonomy is make the argument really short, about 10 seconds, right? A pregnant person has the right to an abortion because a pregnant person is the owner of their body, and they can decide who can and can't access it. Essentially that. So obviously, you don't think that's a sound argument. Tell me why.
Okay. So the bodily autonomy argument is one that's predicated on the acceptance of the statements I've made already, that the unborn is a unique life, and it also is morally valuable, the same as adults. But even though that's true, it's okay for a mother to terminate the child in the womb because she has authority over her
Yes.
body. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. And like and just for clarity, like I'm willing to grant that it's human. I'll grant personhood. I'll grant the fetus all the rights of the mother. All the rights that the mother has. I'll grant all the same rights. It doesn't change the argument.
Something I
Yeah,
want
so-
to clarify, if I can, real quick. Sorry. Something I wanted to clarify is that by termination of the pregnancy, I do want to clarify that you may be going down the road of you have a problem with the procedure itself. So I just wanted to kind of see if that's where we're going here. But yeah, I'd let you kind of go your own road.
Well, if the bodily autonomy argument is true, the procedure doesn't matter. Procedure is irrelevant to the authority of the mother, right?
I agree.
So whether
Yep.
she's doing it in the most horrific, barbaric way or in the most humane, gentle way, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to the question,
agree.
isn't it? She has the authority.
I agree.
Yeah, so irrelevant of the procedures that we use, and abortion procedures have become much quicker, much safer for the mother, and et cetera, over the 50 years that we've had legal abortion in the country. And basically, all of medical technology has improved in any aspect over the past 50 years. So the technique is irrelevant, except when faced with specific hypotheticals, like the violinist hypothetical. There is a reason to talk about procedures in that case. But the argument of bodily autonomy is a strong one. It seems very compelling. What Gio said when he prefaced the argument, it leaves an opening, though. He said when a woman, she has authority over who uses her body. In the vast majority of cases, abortion is after a consensual act, which is foreseeable in the creation of new life.
Sure.
So a lot of pushback on that, and a lot of people would push back and say, well, she consented when she consented to sex.
Sure.
But there are exceptions,
Sure.
obviously.
And
Women get...
Yeah, they get raped, but I would even I don't even have to go there.
Okay.
Because for me, like, consenting to an act does not mean you consented to the risk associated with the act. Like, for instance, like, a risk of driving a car is being in a car wreck. Just because you consented to driving in a car doesn't mean I consented to being in a wreck.
Yeah, that's true. So, but even, that's not always the case. There's not always consent to even the action. There are
Sure.
sometimes women are impregnated through force. And I wanted to make clear that rape is a horrific crime against the integrity of an individual human being, and their value is violated when they are raped. Rapists should be punished to the full extent of the law. And we should make that clear. And I think we all have common ground in that respect. Now, I would respond to the bodily autonomy argument by saying that there's a very, very important distinction between what's happening in the woman's body and any other relationship we have. The unborn child in a woman's body is not a parasite. It is a member of her own species, and it is her offspring. So there's a distinction in the nature of the relationship between the mother and her child and any other relationship that she has, where someone might be in her body, where she could exercise bodily autonomy rights and expel the intruder. I don't think it's fair to say that we treat children the same way we treat any other intruders. So that's one distinction.
Well, sure. I mean, it's like, if a child illegally entered my home, right? Especially if it's a small child, like, I'm not going to resort to violence immediately, right?
Good. That would be very bad. Don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. I will say, hey, once I figure out how did this kid get in my house, and I would still have every right to tell him to
Yes.
exit, and then and even gently remove
Yes,
him.
you have the legal right to remove a child from your house, any trespasser from your house. Typically, you need to get law enforcement to respond because self-help options are very dangerous to take upon yourself. So
Sure.
generally don't expel them unless they're acting violently or dangerously.
Yeah.
On your own. Get help. Get law enforcement. But if it's your own child, you don't have the legal right to remove them from your house.
Well, not of my own. Well, so with my own child, like I agreed to become the child's caretaker, so I have a legal obligation to take care of her.
Yeah, when
So
did that legal
that's-
obligation originate?
I'm not sure exactly on the legality of it. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Currently, legally
I
speaking,
had my kid on purpose. So I mean, I was trying to make a kid. I mean,
I think as far as legality goes, it's at birth because then you're contracted for about 18 years to provide child
sure.
support. But that's just a legality speaking. It's not a
yeah. I mean, and
personal opinion.
there are avenues you can go through to like relieve. Yeah, and there are ways you can go about releasing, like your responsibilities as a parent, and
Yes.
so would your obligations to take care of your kid.
Yeah, the legal obligations. But
Yeah, sure.
so with the analogy of a born child, we see that it would be clearly wrong to neglect a born child. It would be clearly wrong to expel a born child from the obligations of the parent to care for them.
Yes,
And no legal requirement. Morally, that would be wrong.
of course.
Morally, that's
And
appalling.
here's what I'm saying. So with the reason why I have those obligations is because I voluntarily consented to them.
I'm not sure that's true. As a parent, you consented to the action, but you didn't necessarily consent to the responsibility of the resulting effect. Just
You mean
like
the
your
action.
analogy of the driving, you consented to the sex.
Yes, but I didn't consent to the risk
You
associated
did, though.
with the sex.
Paternity requirements, obligations under the moral law, but also under the actual civil law in most states of the United States,
So
they
how about-
require parents, fathers, to take care of resulting children, whether they intended them or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, that's the law, but we're talking about like moral obligations here. So like,
I
so
think
if
morally you're obliged to responsibly care for any children that you have.
well, sure, but you don't have to have the children. And what I was gonna say is having like doing an act doesn't mean you consented to the risk associated with the act. Again, like how about this? A risk of going on dates is being date raped. I go on a date, therefore I consented to being date raped.
Yeah, see,
That makes
but
no sense, right?
No, it doesn't. And that's because it's a third party acting against you in a way. So the same
Mr.
as with getting into an accident in the car. When
Sir-
you throw something, you consent to the risk that the thing you threw could injure another party. You
think it's
don't
funny-
intend it, but you do
Sure.
undertake the responsibility,
that
which
instance,
comes from your
It was funny how
actions.
you mentioned third
So-
party, right? Because
Yes.
like in like by your own admission, the fetus is the third party, right?
Yeah, but the fetus doesn't come about because of their own initiative. They
Sure.
come about because of the actions of the parents.
Yeah, the fetus is a risk from the sex, but it doesn't mean you consented to the risk. Matter of fact, you can even take steps to avoid the risk. So like
Right.
you're definitely not consenting to the risk in this instance.
I think that no matter what precautions you take, you're still responsible for
So
the
even
outcomes of your
so
actions.
even if like literally by living, by existing, there's all sorts of risks that you have to take. I risk being murdered. I risk having a heart attack. I risk falling off my balcony because I live on a fourth floor. Like I'd be consenting to all of those things because those are risks that I'm under.
Yeah, consent isn't the best word to use. You are going to face and you are responsible for the consequences
Sure,
of
but
your own actions, not the actions of others.
Okay,
but your own.
but it sounded like your objection to my bodily autonomy argument was that the sex was consensual because we all gave exceptions for rape.
As I pointed out, when your child is in your home, you have moral obligations to care for them. It's the nature of the relationship that's distinct, and I think it's worth considering. A woman has the authority over her own body and can
Mhm.
expel parasites with lethal force. That is not at issue. What I do have issue with is saying that she has the same authority to expel her own child with lethal force. I don't think it's true. I don't think bodily autonomy carries that much weight. She has a relationship to that child, whatever those circumstances notwithstanding. She has a relationship as a parent to a child. And I don't think it's fair to say bodily autonomy enables her to expel that child, her own child, with lethal force.
So
But there's another distinction with bodily autonomy arguments, comparing it to other relationships.
For s-
Abortion doesn't happen with just simply expelling. Abortion isn't just simply cutting off the nutrients and allowing the child to continue. Abortion is interfering with the natural environment that is purpose made for new life to grow. The uterus is an organ of the human body that has one designed purpose, and we're back to teleology, I know, but we have to
yeah,
go there. It's
I,
designed with the purpose of nurturing and sheltering a new life, not the woman.
I
It's the
gotta disagree
purpose, and
with
that
you
of it.
with that.
Okay.
That's not a purpose. That's a function. Like that's what it does.
Yes,
also
it's
it's
That
by
doesn't mean that's
design.
what it.
also it's procedural, which we said we weren't going to go down. It's the procedure of interfering now that you're having issue with, not the actual just like the eradication of the pregnancy itself. It's the procedure. Oh, well, now you're interfering with the uterus's natural function. Well, I mean, again, that's a procedure. We said we weren't going to
Uh,
go down that road, but now you're
I
going
don't
down that
think I
road.
agreed not to talk about procedure.
Well,
I
I
think
asked
that
at the beginning, did you have a problem
interfering
with the
with the
procedure?
embryo, the uterine design, its function, is a consideration to keep in mind. Parasites that infect a human body, a woman, are not using the parts of the body according to their function. They're interfering. So it's a difference. I'm not saying that I'm going to convince you. I think that the argument of bodily autonomy is the strongest argument, that abortion can be morally acceptable. I'm not persuaded by it because of the relationship between the mother and the child, her own child, and the function of the uterus and its function, which I think supports its design, which I think indicates its purpose, which is to provide care and shelter for a different life,
So
not
okay,
the
so
one.
what about in cases of rape? Now, did you say you gave exceptions for those?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Without regard to the circumstances of a person's conception, they're still equally valuable as human beings and should be protected by the full extent of the law. The only reason rape comes up in these cases is because some people wrongly argue that consent is a necessary element of the responsibility of mother. I don't think it's true. I think
Gotcha. Okay,
regardless of the
we
circumstances.
did it. We disagree on a very metaphysical level
Okay.
of ethics, because for me, any sort of responsibility you have, any obligations you have to consent to them at some point, and there are ways that you can there are proper avenues you can go to relinquish them, but
Yeah.
there's no obligation that's just forced on me, and now I have to act in such a way or I have to do something.
We do disagree on a metaphysical level about ethics. I believe that everyone has moral obligations and duties without any
So would
consent
you say
whatsoever.
there are positive duties? So like
Yes.
for me, okay, so like for me, like there is no duty other than like the obligations that I make, for like my children and people that I take care of, right? But I have no for you, like I'm not your caretaker, so like I'd have no obligations to you other than non-aggression, other than don't steal from you or don't hurt you, etc. I have no obligation to help you in any way. For me, that would be a moral virtue. I wouldn't consider that a moral
Sure.
obligation. But you would say there are moral obligations I have towards you.
Not necessarily toward me, but
Uh-huh.
there are some positive moral obligations, but I don't think we should go in that direction.
Okay.
But looking at what you just talked about with the non-aggression principle, apply that to the bodily autonomy argument. How does it reconcile?
So non-aggression doesn't mean non-violence. It means like I don't violate your property rights. So non-aggression it's not just because you follow non-aggression principle doesn't mean you're a pacifist or anything.
No.
You can behave very violently and be following the non-aggressive principle. So because it has to do with property rights, not about any sort of not any sort of violent
So
act
the
towards another
fetus who
person. So
occupies the uterus that functionally works to provide that fetus protection and nutrients
mhm.
has no property rights in that.
The fetus has property rights to itself. The
And
fetus has its own bodily
okay.
autonomy.
So how does that apply to the non-aggression principle? Because the fetus has property rights to itself, and abortion necessarily harms those rights.
So check this. So like let's say we were on a private island and I had enough food for the both of us. You had no food, right? And the food that I had for both of us, it was all mine. It belonged to me. And so now without this, you're gonna die, right? So you're in a very similar relationship with me as a mother and a unborn fetus, right? I have no obligation to give you any of the food, even though without it you're gonna die. Like a need does not confer a right, even if you
Correct.
need it, even if you need it to live.
Yeah.
So
So what that allows you to do is withhold the food from me, but it doesn't allow you to push me into the ocean.
we would have to change the analogy to me owning the island, and then it would get really more complicated because we talk about how you got there and everything. But
Yeah. And
so
I think that the argument of bodily autonomy just fails to fully address these kinds of complications where the unborn human child is relationally connected to the mother and where he or she is in the position where naturally he or she would be. There's no unnatural interference to put an embryo in a uterus. That's when nature's working correctly. They will be in the uterus. And because of those two important points, I think that the bodily autonomy argument doesn't work. Just because she has autonomy to control her own body does not mean she has the right to kill the unborn human child, her own
so
unborn human child.
So does she
the
have the
way
right to remove her uterus entirely, assuming there's an implanted embryo?
I think that would, I mean, now we're talking about procedure. I think that would still fall afoul of the same principles, that it would kill the unborn child. If she chooses to have
But that's just an outcome.
hysterectomy prior to impregnation or after impregnation, after birth, or that's not a problem.
But I'm saying, like, it seems to me like if she has one while she's pregnant, I mean, the outcome is that the child's going to die, but she has the right to remove her uterus if she wants, right?
When there's a third party effect, when there's externalities that interfere with the rights of others, I don't think it applies. I don't think she can have a hysterectomy when her own child is dependent
so
upon
the
it for
child
life.
has a right to the other person's uterus.
Yes, the child
So
does. The
so the
child does
uterus
because
belongs to the child in a
the
sense.
uterus belongs to the mother, the child belongs to the mother, and the mother is responsible for the care and provision
But
of the
okay,
child.
no, but when you say a child belongs to the mother, we're not talking about in the same way that a uterus belongs to the mother. Like the uterus is part of the mother.
Yeah,
It's part of the mother's
there's
body,
a
right?
distinction.
Okay, but that uterus does not belong to the child. That child is just using it. a mother had a claim of property on it well before that child existed.
Sure, absolutely. And hopefully she will continue to have a claim of property on it after the child is born and for any
So she gives up her own
subsequent
rights because of pregnancy?
I'm sorry, say that again, Facade.
So she gives up her rights to her own uterus because she's pregnant?
Yes, to a degree she does. She cannot kill an unborn human child because that is morally wrong. Even though that consequently means she cannot control her own uterus for 9 months.
Huh.
So I didn't want to bring it up, but what's the?
I'll give you that.
I didn't want to necessarily bring it up, but you mentioned it earlier. So just, I mean, I assume I know what your answer is, but like, what are your thoughts on like the violinist thought experiment?
Yeah, the distinctions there are relatively the same. It's the relationship between the woman and the other entity, the violinist versus the child, her own child. So the relationship aspect is a distinction.
What if that
makes a difference.
violinist?
And
Sorry, I was gonna ask. What if that violinist happened to be the
Adult child of the mother.
of the mother, or not
Yeah.
even adult? Like it's the kid, the 6-year-old. He plugs up to his mom.
well, then
Way
it's
back.
a prodigy of violinist expertise that a 6-year-old is world famous violinist. That's
Yes.
even more you know, reason for the Violin Lovers Society to have intervened in this way. For those of you of the audience that might not know this experiment, so let me set it up so that this makes sense. The thought experiment was offered decades ago, I think in the 80s, that there's a world famous violinist. He has a bizarre health problem. The only solution is to plug him into a woman who was kidnapped in the middle of the night by Violin Music Lovers Society, and she was subjected to this medical intervention. So the violinist is plugged to her for 9 months, but it's okay. She will be there for 9 months, and then the violinist will be free to go, and she'll be free to go, and it's great. All she has to do is let him use her bodily organs for 9 months. Okay, so anyways, that's the thought experiment. So as I said, the relationship is a distinction. The procedure would be a distinction then, because
Not in this case. The relationship's identical.
okay, so
talking
yeah.
about
So in
mother,
this
child.
hypothetical, the adjustment, it's her own biological child. So
Yes.
the relationship is present, but the nature of how we care for our children does change. When a woman is pregnant with a child, the uterus is designed to provide the care and health and nutrition for the child. Her kidneys are not designed for the child. If the child is born and subsequently requires a kidney transplant to live, I don't think that women are morally obliged. It's not a positive moral obligation, as you pointed out.
I gotta
For
push back on this
her-
design thing though, because like the uterus isn't designed for that. It's a function. Like that's what it.
I
does.
don't see a
Okay.
distinction between. If that's what it does, that's what it was designed to do. They're synonymous in my
Really?
mind.
So
I'll use function if you want me to, but I think they're the same.
well, sure. Well, if I pick up a rock and bash you over the head with it, the rock wasn't designed to bash Sean in the head. That's just what it was used for.
Yeah, your hands were never designed to murder either, but that's how they function. But
yeah, well,
here-
yeah,
just
it's a
goes to
function.
further
That's
the
what I'm
point.
saying. So
the uterus isn't functioning in any other way. It doesn't function in any other way. It
sure, but
is
that doesn't
designed
mean it was
for-
designed to do that.
I don't see how you come to that conclusion, but it's not important. The kidneys they function to keep the mother alive.
No, but it is.
If the child is born and later requires a kidney transplant to live, and without a kidney transplant from a match, namely his or her mother, he will die.
So
I don't think that the woman is morally obliged to surrender her kidneys. The relationship is there, but the requirement of the care is not the same. Women don't have to go to extraordinary measures to surrender their own organs to save their born children. I don't think
can
they're
I
morally
explain? So
obliged
the
to do
reason
that.
why the design is important because when we talk, the reason I'm saying it's not a design because there's no evidence of a design. We just know what it does, and so just like the uterus, the function it's serving is keeping the child alive, and in this same analogy, that's exactly what the kidney is doing. The function it's serving is to keep her child alive. In this violinist analogy, they're doing this. They're the same function. They're doing different ways. What one is recycling blood, the other is a little sack of baby tissue
Amniotic
and
fluid.
stuff. But
It's actually the most extraordinary organ in the human body by my arguments. But
sure, but the function in broadly speaking is identical. They're
no, the
keeping
function is
they're
only,
keeping
it's
keeping the
not
child
directly
alive.
keeping the child alive. It's keeping the mother alive, which indirectly also keeps the child alive.
No,
The
but in
uterus
the
does not
kidney
keep
it
a woman
would. 'Cause
alive. It doesn't provide her
we're talking
any
about a kid.
benefit. It provides a woman zero benefit to have a uterus. It provides the unborn child all the benefits the child needs to live.
For sure.
That's its function,
So let's
which I
just,
believe is its design.
if I might, let's just
Yeah.
alter the experiment just a tad. Let's say
Sure.
we've come up with the violinist thought experiment. We'll use the exact same scenario where the violinist is a child of the person that was abducted. But the plug-in only impacts the woman's uterus, and because of the natural
And that's where
properties
the
of
distinction, the
uterus,
third distinction. Sorry.
yeah, I was just gonna say, because of the natural properties of the uterus, it utilizes the nutrient production that would happen in just like in instances of pregnancy to the violinist.
Okay, so
Now you have a codependent
suspending
relationship.
disbelief to think that this would actually happen, I can address that. The distinction still remains the third distinction, and that's the distinction of the natural condition of the two parties. In pregnancy, it's a natural condition to have an unborn child in a uterus. If the woman was abducted and plugged into a born person at whatever age, and her uterus was used to provide the care and nutrients to her child, that's an unnatural condition. So I think the moral obligations change as well when the condition is natural versus unnatural.
I mean, it's a little
So-
pedantic, but naturally her egg would just get disposed of. So yes, that's the end of the statement.
When there's no insemination, yeah.
Yeah,
that's
so
true,
so
but I don't-
naturally she
yeah,
would
but
never get
I don't
pregnant.
have the same moral value attached to an egg that I do to a human being. That's,
So all I was
think,
saying is that
from the
naturally
beginning
she'd
of the
never
argument.
get pregnant on her own. So it wouldn't matter. She'd naturally never be in a state of pregnancy.
If you accept the idea, which I think is a rather laughable one, that sex is an unnatural thing.
No, I'm just saying that naturally on her own accord. So what you're saying is an unnatural situation, like a second party, in this case a male, would have to inseminate her in order for her to become pregnant. And in the case of the violin, a secondary person, male or female, doesn't really matter, but would utilize the uterus in the same way that semen utilizes the implementation of the egg. So it to me, there's no distinction available. There just isn't. You have an occurrence of a person of direct lineage to this person utilizing their nutrients without their consent.
You really don't see a distinction between medical intervention where a woman is plugged into a human adult and insemination.
I mean, I see that the woman still has
Which
her
has
own
been
her
the-
own
the
rights to her own
natural-
uterus. That is the position I would hold no matter what. She has her own rights to her own uterus, and no one else does. And no one can take away those rights.
I disagree, but I think that's the strongest argument for support of abortion.
I don't see why it being natural should have any impact on it. There's a lot of things that occur in nature that shouldn't be, right? I mean,
Right.
like cancer is perfectly natural. Right.
I would disagree with that
Really?
statement.
Cancer?
Yeah, I think cancer is a result of mutations, which are
That's
detrimental.
they're
to the
natural
natural
mutations.
order.
are natural.
Yeah.
Because when the genetic code copies,
If you're
it copies
referring to
perfectly.
natural as in physiologically occurring in the physical world, yeah, it's natural. If you mean that's actually the way that they're supposed to act, no.
Well,
They're a result of a
you said-
failure to act according to what they were designed to do. And I can't escape the design argument. And you talked about we don't have evidence of what it's designed to do. We just have evidence of how it functions. But how do you determine what a book is supposed to do except for what it actually says? It functions that way, therefore it was designed
Well, in the
that
case
way.
of the book,
I think
it'd be an
function
author.
is an excellent evidence of design,
So, like-
and I'm surprised that you discount it.
Well, in the case of a book, like, or any sort of invention, like there's someone around, like the inventor's around, that can tell you how he designed it and what purpose he had in mind.
Mark Twain is dead.
Yeah. So, like,
well
but, like,
aware,
so-
but we have many of
Yeah.
accounts of how he wanted you to read his material. We also have commentary from him, etc. And even if you
Yeah.
don't, like based
for-
on
like,
other
for instance,
authors,
like-
you can just kind of come to the conclusion. And you
For
know,
instance-
like, go ahead. Sorry.
I think
I'm
it's
not-
fair to come to the same conclusion based on the biological function of organs. I disagree with your idea that function does not give evidence of design. I just
So-
disagree.
okay,
The hand was designed to grasp things and lift them. It doesn't mean it was intended to use a rock to bash someone's head in, but it was
no.
designed to allow human beings to lift and move. And the
how about
uterus would
this?
provide care and nutrients to an unborn
So
child.
how about, so like, let's say, Facade and I, we both work in an IT field. We both work in computer science, right? We have advanced degrees in computer science. So we talk about like software a lot. Is I'm designing it to do a specific thing, right? To do A.
Yeah.
And I put the code in, and I was kind of
Yeah.
sleepy when I was working, so some of my scripts are off, and it does something else, but it does this other thing really well. You would look at that thing that it does really well and say, "Oh, it must have been designed to do that," and you would be totally wrong. It's a
Yeah,
function that it
that's
does
true.
very well, but it's
Yeah.
not. It's not what the design was.
Yeah, and in some situations, the exception proves the rule. Like when I look to something and say, hey, it's functioning really great at this, it must have been designed, I might be wrong. But that's on me. But I think that in the vast majority of cases, looking at the design, you're going to be right. That was what it was designed for. Because
I think you're
Geo
falling
doesn't
into the-
typically fall asleep and put the wrong code in and miraculously have it function really well at some other object. That doesn't happen. You guys know that doesn't happen very often with coding.
But I
If you
think-
mess up the code or the script in one way, it's going to destroy the whole program. It doesn't actually come about into great functions. If it did, it would be a miracle, and it would be the exception to prove the rule.
I think you're kind of falling into the mud puddle fallacy here, but I mean, I could be wrong, but I just kind of wanted to point that out. I also wanted to point out we're going on 7:20, and I know Geo feeds his kid about this time. So if
Okay,
we want
so
to continue, we can. I just
you'll
wanted
have to
kind of-
send me a message about that mud puddle fallacy because I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, yeah, we can address it later. I can direct
Yeah.
message you on Facebook and whatnot, but it's not a huge deal. I just kind of wanted to bring that up. Geo, do you have time to continue? Do we need? I know you typically.
10 minutes.
I think we've also covered the abortion topic pretty well. We're getting into the much more deep conversation that has to happen about
Yeah.
the nature of human beings, what
Okay.
their purpose is, what their value is. And those are really necessary and important conversations. But I hope that today that I was able to at least articulate clearly the pro-life position that every human being is equally valuable and that it is always morally wrong to take an innocent human life. Abortion takes an innocent human life, and therefore abortion's always wrong. That was my goal.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I have the time, I'll address the mud puddle fallacy, which I think you were kind of falling into here when talking about design, function, and purpose. And it was actually probably perceived by Douglas Adams, who's a science fiction author. He wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But he essentially, the quote was, this is rather, if you imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in, an interesting hole I find myself in. It fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well. It must have been made to have me in it. And so obviously the mud puddle fallacy is that you observe something that is, and it functions a particular way, and therefore it must have been designed to function as the hole for the mud puddle. Where in reality, as the sun rises and dries out the water that's inside, it's not going to be a mud puddle, it's going to be mud, then dirt, then dust, and then eventually no water will persist in it if it continues to remain hot. Whereas if it continues to rain or if other natural phenomena occur, it may grow in size and turn into something as large as a lake. The problem is with the mud puddle fallacy is that you're saying that these things have a specific function and purpose, so therefore it must be designed, just like the hole for the mud puddle must have been designed for the mud puddle. Whereas the reality is you have functions that exist that we can observe, and we all pretty much agree across the board biologically how these things happen, but that doesn't lend a lot of credence to design. It lends a lot of credence to this is how they function, but if things work differently, we would say that must be how they were designed. Just like you said, like a hand isn't necessarily used to bash people with rocks. Why would we say that, bashing people with rocks is what hands were designed for? Sure, that's a function they could perform, but that's not really what people typically use them for, at least hopefully not.
I think at the end there, Facade, you kind of pointed out the limitations of the mud puddle fallacy. It's very narrow in scope and in time. The mud puddle only exists as a mud puddle for a very short time, and it may occasionally encase a man foolish enough to fall into it in mud, but generally it doesn't function that way. And it's the same with the hand. The human hand doesn't generally, thank God, spend its time bashing other people in the head. But it could be done that way.
Yeah, and so the uterus only lives for the life of the woman.
Because it's not narrow. I'm not looking at this narrow point in time with the uterus. I'm looking at every human woman throughout all of recorded history, everyone we've ever met. Their uterus has a purpose of caring for the child. I don't think I'm falling into a mud puddle at all.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, what you're saying though is that because it functions this way, it must have been designed to. We're not saying that it doesn't do it well. We're just saying that there's no evidence that it was designed as such. Just like there's no evidence that the mud puddle was designed, the hole for the mud puddle to sit in was designed to be there. It functions that way, and it fits the mud puddle well in this current status. But in the future, that may change.
Yeah, and with the uterus,
that doesn't give credence to
doesn't
design.
change its nature ever.
But the point is, it doesn't lead to design. A, you don't know that, and then B, that doesn't lead to design.
Change its function?
Its function does not change. Its function is to provide nutrients for the child, and that's it.
You can look up the evolution of the uterus. We're getting away.
Yeah, my point is, it doesn't.
Topic.
Yeah, my point is, it just doesn't lead credence to design. I was saying the point isn't to just dispute the function of the uterus. I mean, we all agree that's what it does, and it does it remarkably well. The point is, it doesn't lend any credence to its design, because if things were different, you wouldn't be able to say, "Oh, well, it must have been designed for something else." You would say, "Yeah, sure, the mud puddle fits well now, because it fits well now."
I'm sorry, Facade. Your standard for evidence made me laugh because you said it does that now, but it doesn't give evidence because it might not do it in the future. I'm sorry. What I see as actually functioning gives me evidence of what is designed to happen.
Yeah, that's kind of
and that's all I can say. We've talked about evidence. We've talked about this mud puddle fallacy, which I've learned for the first time tonight. So I appreciate that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead. We need to get you back on. We have a much deeper conversation about talk about ethics and what it is to be a human and humanism and all sorts of stuff. Because I think there's a lot more under the surface that we disagree on, which is causing our disagreement on abortion. That's what I think is going on.
I'd like to cede the last few minutes to anything you'd like to say. You can have, if you'd like to plug anything or point out anything, you're more than welcome to do so. And when you're done, we'll end the show.
Well, I appreciate your time. I will conclude with this. I think that we had a comment early on in the show, and I kind of laughingly dismissed it as asked and answered. What's your view on abortion? And if the comment was directed at me, I think my response is appropriate. I've tried my best to answer that clearly and completely. But what I find is actually true is I don't know what Facade and Geo actually think about abortion. This conversation was pretty one-sided. I talked a lot. They didn't have a lot of opportunity to talk about their own views. But I would encourage these two hosts to consider that question from Jim. What is your feeling on abortion? What's your position? And if you support abortion, why? What's the distinctive that allows abortion to be morally justifiable, but embryo or killing a born child would be morally repugnant? That's the question I want to leave them with. What are your feelings on abortion? And why? So I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good night.
Thank you so much. We'll see you guys next week.